Okay, so we're still in Unit 7 today. We're moving on from the Roaring Twenties vibe, and we're talking sort of about the economic times. So we're really hitting the late 1920s here. We're going to talk about some of the presidents before that, but we're going to hit the Great Depression during this time. So going from that huge prosperity to extreme depression. And we're going to hit questions 5 through 7, 17 through 22, and number 24. So we're talking about 1920 here. So Warren Harding, this guy over here pointing his finger at you, he runs in 1920 on the idea of returning to normalcy. So for number 5, what does this mean? So it's sort of returning to the simpler times before World War I. The idea of maybe we should sort of stop with all this sort of new age thinking, this kind of stuff, and return to the times before where things were simpler, things were easier, and sort of more fundamental, more basic. And what this leads to also, though, is sort of the return of isolationist policies, so sort of staying out of other people's business, but also not willing to listen to other ideas. And also you could talk about here, they have higher tariffs, so that's really showing that we're trying to keep things here, we're trying to make people buy American goods. And we also have a very discriminatory quota system, so how many people can come into the country from other areas of the world is strictly regulated at this time in the U.S. And once again, we're talking about that same theme we were talking about the last lecture, is that clash, so conflict between past and present. So now we're moving to the Harding scandals. So Harding's got this sort of return to normalcy slogan, but he also has some scandals when he's in office as well. So we're talking about the first thing is the Ohio gang. So he was from Ohio, he was in government in Ohio. So when he became president, he brought a lot of his buddies with him. And that's what this Ohio gang was talking about. So it's not really a gang, but it's a group of individuals, like his gang of buddies who came with him to the office. And some of them, actually a good many of them, were underqualified for the positions he gave them. It was sort of returning back to that idea of the spoils system. So the idea of the winner gets the spoils, to the winner goes the spoils. So giving his buddies the jobs because he can. But the big one to remember here, so for number 6, is this Teapot Dome scandal. So that's the major scandal he's associated with. So what happened? So we're still on number 6 here. So basically the U.S. owned these oil-rich lands in Wyoming. And generally the way it works is if you have these very rich lands and you're willing to lease them out to companies, well, generally private companies come in and they bid for it. So it's a competitive sort of process where the government's not just giving away lands to their buddies, to people they like, that it's actually a competitive process where people have to offer money to get access to it. Well, at this time, though, that competitive process was sort of bypassed, and this guy named Albert B. Fall took the fall for this because he sort of pushed it to someone he wanted to have it and sort of bypassed that competitive process. So the thing to remember with him as well is that he is the first U.S. cabinet member. So we talked about cabinets all the way back to Washington. First U.S. cabinet member. He was a Secretary of the Interior to be convicted and go to jail as a member of the cabinet. And then so they have all these scandals going along, and then sort of tragically Warren Harding dies. He passes away, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, takes office. So that's where we're moving on to number 7 here. So what was his belief about American business? So it's that same term we've been talking about, laissez-faire. So keep your hands off sort of business, keep it small government, don't interfere. And that's sort of shown in those quotes below, or those sort of slogans, keep cool with Coolidge and do nothing Cal. So the idea of sort of he's going to sit back and let the market dictate what happens. Okay, now we're moving on. So the beginnings of the Great Depression. So after Coolidge leaves office, we have this guy named Herbert Hoover who comes into the presidency. So in 1928, and you talk about sort of coming into office and being just sort of punched in the face automatically. So he's elected in 1928, which means he doesn't come into office till 1929. He comes in like March, and then on October 29, 1929, you have the stock market crash. So the nickname here for number 17 is called Black Tuesday. So that's the nickname given to the day the stock market crashed. So that's what it is and the nickname. What this means is, as you can see from the chart there, so stock prices are incredibly high. People are making a lot of money. People are thinking that the economy is going to keep shooting up. And then that day, so you have Black Tuesday, you have this huge, significant drop off in prices. And it keeps going down and down and down all the way into 1932. So a huge, huge depression in U.S. history. So now, moving on, so whenever something like this happens, you always have a government reaction to it. And this is where Hoover steps in. So his philosophy for dealing with the Depression was this term underneath his name there, so rugged individualism. And it pretty much is what it sounds like. So the idea of sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, that sort of slogan, and helping yourself. His idea was that the government shouldn't step in and help individuals, that will only make individuals dependent on the government and hurt the American spirit. So his idea was that if I jump in here and we sort of give money to individuals, then all it's going to do is make them dependent, make them not want to work in the long run, and sort of hurt that drive that supposedly America is built on. But he is more than happy to funnel money into businesses. So he really tries to help businesses. His idea is if he can boost businesses back up, get the stocks going back up, then people will start getting hired again, and he'll sort of try to correct the situation. So the public's reaction to this, obviously, if money's constantly going to businesses and not them, they're going to get pretty upset. So they really felt like Hoover was ignoring them. Hoover was focused on businesses and didn't really care about individual citizens. And sort of the funny thing here is, so when Hoover ran, he ran on this slogan of 2 cars in every garage. So the idea of he's going to bring back prosperity. He's going to bring all this money to the U.S., make us really have this boom in U.S. history. So he believed that eventually we're going to have 2 cars in every garage. So every family would have 2 cars in their own house's garage. But when all this stuff happened, when the stock market crashed, people started saying, hey, maybe he should have ran on the slogan of 2 families in every garage, because people started losing their homes, people couldn't pay their bills, and they're sort of playing on that slogan and saying, hey, because of you, now 2 families are living in every garage. And then we also have this thing emerge called Hoovervilles. So during this time, like I said, people couldn't pay their bills, people were losing their houses, people were becoming homeless at an incredibly high rate. So these shanty towns emerged, which are basically sort of man-made structures, so they're sort of building it based on whatever you can find, so scrap wood, tin, that kind of things, sort of living in these huge areas in the sort of metropolitan cities. And the public's reaction to this is calling them Hoovervilles, so they're sort of blaming it on Hoover, saying it's your fault that we're all living in these, and that's why we're going to call them Hoovervilles. You see a lot of poverty at this time. You see like soup lines, people standing in lines trying to feed their families, all kinds of things happening now. But the public is showing their sort of disdain for Hoover and his policies. Now we have precursors to the Great Depression. So we're moving on to number 20 now. The question is, even before the majority of the country entered the Depression, what group of people were in economic trouble during the 1920s, and why? So the first thing you want to mention here, it's a really important one, the World War I vets. So when they were in World War I, the government promised them a bonus that would be paid to them at some point after World War I. Well, they never received this bonus. They're in really tough times. A lot of them were suffering from sort of injuries that they still were being affected by, post-traumatic stress, which it wasn't called then, but sort of they were suffering from signs of this. And that's where you get the bonus Army March on Washington. So World War I vets are marching into Washington, protesting, showing their disdain for the government and saying, you promised us this and we deserve it. We served for our country, you promised us a bonus and we deserve it. What? The government responds by basically sending troops on these World War I vets. So it's an incredibly big black eye for Hoover and on the U.S. public that the government's going to send in troops to make these World War I veterans disperse. So a big so they were having tough times, and then the government sort of sends in troops to get them to leave. And the other group, farmers. So we continuously talk about farmers having a really tough time, and it continues in this period. So farm prices continue to drop, really tough times out there, and we're going to get to the Dust Bowl, which means farm prices are already low, and then the Dust Bowl only makes it worse. But major causes of the Great Depression, so for number 21, you could literally list hundreds. There are hundreds of causes for the Great Depression, but we're going to focus on 3 and then sort of a theme throughout them. So one thing is overproduction. So we're talking about businesses here. So businesses that are producing something, producing a good for people to buy. So at this time, the stock markets are before the crash. Stocks are going up. Business owners are thinking, hey, look at the stock prices soaring. We're going to keep producing. We're going to overproduce because it looks like the stock's going to keep going up and people are going to want our things. What happens is, though, once that crashes, you have all your money invested in these goods, and you have no one to buy them as the stock market crashes. So all your money's wrapped in these things that nobody wants. Companies are going out of business left and right. And then you have speculation. So speculation is buying a stock based on what you think it's going to be in the future. So you're speculating that it's going to be higher. And obviously this worked for a little bit, but then when it crashed, that speculation just absolutely drowned. So all your money is just gone. So you bought this stock, and then it's basically down to nothing very, very quickly. There's also another thing that really sort of pushed speculation to even a tougher point. People were speculating while they were buying on the margin. So this is a really sort of interesting term because you're basically borrowing money to buy more stock. So when that stock's really high, that's fine because you're making money, the stock continues to go up, so you can pay off that money you used to buy the stock. Problem is, when it crashes, not only do you lose all of your money, but now you owe money to banks. You owe money to the people you borrowed money for, like borrowed money from, to buy the stock. The third thing we're going to talk about is limited bank regulations. So the banks at this time were continuing that sort of theme of not regulating the money as much as we think of today, and this led to when that stock crashed, all their money sort of lent out. It wasn't very regulated. Your money's not completely guaranteed at this point, and a lot of chaos ensues. And the thing to remember here is the chain reaction. So when the stock market crashes, it's a chain reaction. So overproduction leads to all companies having things wrapped up in goods nobody wants. Speculation buying on the margin leads to huge losses for investors. Limited bank regulation means your money's not safe. So it's like once this crash happens, everything sort of compounds and everything just gets worse. So now we're talking about the Dust Bowl. So going back to sort of what we're talking about, the farmers. So what was it? So first off, it was a famine. So an incredibly long drought in the lower plains of the U.S. So that's what it was. And it was also sort of combined with, in the mid-1930s, you have these huge windstorms that are coming through the Great Plains. So that's what you can see in the picture there on the top right. These are big windstorms that are basically swirling up dust and they could bury houses and stuff like that. It was that much dust. So its causes were, once again, basically a severe drought that hit the U.S. And this is where sort of the impact of it, so farmers are incredibly hurt at this time. Tough time for them, and that's where you see some literature that actually comes out of this, and some photography as well that comes out of this really tough time in America. You have The Grapes of Wrath, which is by John Steinbeck, talking about how all these individuals in Oklahoma were moving, the Okies as they were called, moving, trying to find work. Their farms are destroyed, they have no money left, and they're sort of moving around. Now The Grapes of Wrath is considered an American classic, but it's really sort of showing readers the tough times the Dust Bowl caused, compounding with the Great Depression at the same time. And you also have a photographer who becomes to like the center stage here. Her name's Dorothea Lange, and this is one of her pictures. It's probably her most famous picture that I'm sure a lot of you have seen, but it's sort of showing this woman with her children sort of hiding there behind her, sort of putting their heads on her shoulders. And she's just the idea is she is just trying to find some way to feed her family, some way to protect her family from all of these problems in the sort of lower plains. And the last thing for today, so Mexican Americans in the Great Depression. This is not a story that's told very much, but it's a really, really sort of telling time for the U.S. government and a really sort of black eye on the U.S. government. So we have this thing called, so for number 24, so what caused a significant drop in population of Mexican Americans during the Great Depression? This thing called the Mexican repatriation. So it's there for number 24 on the screen. So it's from 1929 to 1939. And basically 500,000 plus, so some people estimate it's over like 1 million. Mexican Americans were sort of forced out of the country, sent back to Mexico, and there was no due process. They didn't do most of them didn't do anything. In fact, pretty much all of them did nothing wrong, but they were forced out. And this was authorized by Herbert Hoover, and it was pretty much blatant discrimination. Their thought was if we can get rid of all these individuals who, like we have discriminatory policies against, then maybe it wouldn't cost as much for the U.S. government to sort of help everyone who needs something at this time. So their plan was basically to send Mexican Americans back to Mexico and just rid them of this problem. The problem is it's completely it's racist, it's discriminatory, and it's completely unfair because these people did nothing wrong at all. And this sort of goes back to that nativist policies that the U.S. government was using at this time, and that is all.